If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet. I want to welcome somebody very special here with us, Brigadier General McGill Alexander, paratrooper of note, also a man who holds a PhD, and is a man who wrote several books. Sir, you are most welcome with us. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Let us start, sir. Where do you come from? How was your childhood? How did you end up in the South African Army?
Thank you, Chris. I think that's quite a deep question because I've got fairly deep roots in South Africa. The first of my ancestors to set foot in the country was an 1820 settler. So they arrived here more than 200 years ago, and they landed on the shores of Algoa Bay. And they gradually spread through the country. I'm proud to say that they contributed significantly to the development of the country. And that has always made me proud of being a South African. I know there are many South Africans whose roots go back far deeper than that. But 200 years is okay for me. I'm comfortable with that. I know that they also participated in almost every war that our country was involved in since they arrived in the country. As is the case with most people who participate in wars, you're sometimes on the right side and sometimes you're on the wrong side. And the interpretation of which is the right side and which is the wrong side always depends on who is telling the story. Nevertheless, they did fight in many wars in South Africa. And I grew up aware of conflict in the terms of wars, because in my family, the wars that we had participated in were spoken about, and they were spoken about quite frequently. I was born in 1947. I was born in a little mine house, a corrugated iron mine house on the ERPM mine, which is in Boksburg. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a blacksmith, and he worked on the mine, and he lived in a little semi-detached mine house, which is where I happened to be born. My parents weren't living in Boksburg at the time. My father was a farmer, and he farmed on a very small farm in the Free State on the banks of the Vaal River. So it was only just in the Free State. And the little town that was nearest to us was at a town by the name of Bloemhof. There were no facilities there. There was no hospital there. In fact, there was no doctor. The nearest doctor was in Christiana, which was another 30-odd kilometers or miles, maybe 50 kilometers or more away. So it was decided that my mother would go up to Boksburg and for the confinement, and again, she didn't go into hospital. I was born in the house. Almost immediately afterwards, they returned to the farm, and that's where I spent the first part of my life, was on the farm. It was a lonely life. It was a primitive life. We had very little in the way of facilities. There was no running water. There was no waterborne sewage. There was no electricity. Our house was a corrugated iron shack. And gradually, my father built a couple of rondavels, which gave us a bit more comfort. But we lived a very basic sort of life on the farm. My father was a Second World War veteran. My grandfather was a First World War veteran. And so I could go back through the Anglo-Boer War, the frontier wars of the Eastern Cape, the Zulu Rebellion of 1906. I had ancestors who served in all of those. So the concept of anything military was not foreign to me as I grew up. It was often spoken about. And although my father didn't reminisce a great deal about the war, I was very conscious of the fact that he was an old soldier. On the farm, he wore bits and pieces of his old uniform because that's what was available. So it was not unusual to see him on the horse with his service cap on. He wore the khaki pants that he'd worn during the war. That was all part of my growing up. I was very conscious of that. But at the same time, the community that we lived in was not an English-speaking community. It was Afrikaans, it was predominantly Afrikaans. All the farmers and the surrounding farms were Afrikaans. In the town, things were Afrikaans. The businesses were run by Afrikaans people, most of them. There were a handful of English-speaking people, but very, very few. Most of my father and my mother's friends were Afrikaans. On the farm, we had a family, a black family that worked for us. They spoke Tswana. I grew up speaking a bit of Tswana, but mostly because my father spoke Afrikaans to them. They spoke Afrikaans, and I spoke Afrikaans to them as well. So I grew up speaking a lot of Afrikaans. And when the time came to go to school, the little school in Bloemhof was an Afrikaans school. It was a small school. It accommodated students from grade 1 to what is known as grade 12 today, matric. They were all in the same school. And I wonder if there were 6 English-speaking children in the school. They were all Afrikaans. So when I started school, I did my schooling in Afrikaans. The interesting part about it was that initially, to get to school, and the school our farm was not very far from the town. We were probably about 8 or 10 kilometers from the town. But to get to school every day, my father had a horse, and he had old Johannes who worked for us. The next door farmer had a horse cart. The horse would be spanned in by old Johannes to the horse cart. The farmer on the farm next door to us had a daughter who was about my age, also starting school. And the two of us would get onto the cart in the mornings, and the cart would trundle off to Bloemhof. And on the way, we would pick up other children at the other farms that we passed through. The farms were all very narrow, because the idea was that every farm should have some river frontage to be able to access the water. So it meant that when you took the dirt road, the sand road to Bloemhof, there were a lot of gates to go through between the different farms. My job was to jump off of the wagon, the cart, and open the gates, and then close them after old Johannes had driven the horse cart through. And probably for about 6 months, that's how I went to school every day. Johannes would outspan below the water tanks in the school grounds, and he'd wait until school ended, and then I would climb back onto the cart with the other children, and he would take us home. Mornings were quite rushed because there was quite a lot that had to be done, including milking the cows and various other things. So we only got going after quite a bit of farm chores that had to be completed. And then when we got back in the evenings, we had to carry on doing more farm chores. So it was quite a tough life in that sense. And then there was a crisis in my family. My parents were not happily married, and the marriage went through a lot of strains and struggles. And eventually, there was an affair between the farmer next door and my mother, and that put an end to the horse and cart arrangement. And so another option had to be found for me. So I was sent to boarding school in Bloemhof. The so-called hostel was not a hostel in the sense that one knows it today. It was just a couple of houses that were used as a boarding establishment for the school. And we stayed there. And the boys and girls in the hostels were from grade 1, like myself, all the way up to matric. It was quite hard, quite harsh. I have a very vivid memory of, and one must bear in mind that this was in the early 1950s. So it was only 50 years after the end of the Anglo-Boer War. And for those of us who think back, those of us my age who think back 50 years, I've been married 50 years this year, and it doesn't seem very long ago. So the memories of the Boer War were still very, very much alive at that stage. Many of my fellow hostel inmates had grandparents who survived the British concentration camps. And feelings would run quite high. And of course, it was just after the nationalist victory at the polls. There was a new government. My father was a bloedsap. Political meetings tended to, I mean, we get upset these days when we see what the EFF and the ANC get up to at their political meetings. I think that's child's play in comparison to what used to take place at political meetings in those days, when the bloedsapper and the natter would climb into each other and break chairs over one another's heads and really go to town. So this was the era that I grew up in. And the vivid memory that I have is one evening at the meal, most of the guys in the hostel at my table in the dining hall were older boys, probably 17, 18 years old. I remember that several of them were shaving already, and they had little moustaches that were growing already. So in a sense, they were like men. And I was sitting at the table, and I got my bread, and we each would be allowed one little square of butter. And the squares of butter were all on a dish, and the dish was up the other end of the table. And as I sat there, I dared to raise my voice, and I said, "Kan ek die botter kry asseblief?" And one of these the table went silent. This was probably one of my first meals at the hostel. The table went silent, and this very large guy at the head of the table glared down at me, and he said, "Hou jou bek, Rooinek." And I shrunk into my little chair, and I took my dry bread and I ate it without butter. So that was a memory I had from way back then. But yet my friends were all Afrikaans. And I remember them very, very clearly. I remember the boys. I remember their names. My best friend was a fellow called Neville Bierkes. And we used to have great fun together. So there may have been a lot of tension at a higher level, but for boys at school, it wasn't really an issue at all. But my parents separated, My grandfather had retired by then. He was living down in East London. My mother went to go and live with him and her sisters and my grandmother. And so I was taken down to East London and I was put into a new school, and it was an English school. So I had to start all over again. What I remember about that particular school was that, and it was a very good school and a very good teacher. I remember the teacher was very good, but there was one thing about her that that did affect me for the rest of my life, and that is that I had been identified as being left-handed. So, and they had no problem with that when I was at Bloemhof School. But when I got to Cambridge Junior School in East London, the teacher said, no, this is not acceptable. You got to learn to write with your right hand. That was rough, but I learned to write with my right hand. And today I write with my right hand. Although my left hand is still quite usable, I write right-handed, which is more convenient anyway. So, you know, I had the normal sort of issues that a young boy has at school. But the year after that, my parents tried again. So we went back to Bloemhof and I went back to the Afrikaans school. Now, what I do say about this and what I'm eternally grateful about is that it gave me an incredibly good grounding in Afrikaans in two ways. One, in the language. And I never, ever in my life had problems with Afrikaans as a language. My accent wasn't always the greatest, but I never had a problem. I always enjoyed Afrikaans and I had no problem speaking Afrikaans. But the other thing I think was far more profound, and that is that it gave me a very deep insight into the psyche of the Afrikaans people. And I think I was fortunate in that I had perhaps a better understanding than most English-speaking people of the Afrikaners. And in fact, a love of the Afrikaners. I enjoyed the Afrikaners. I enjoyed being with them. So this all played a part in my early life. I do need to say that my grandfather and my father, who I both knew, I never knew my grandfather on my father's side. He was a medical doctor in Christiana, and was the only medical doctor there for about 35 years. So he had quite a deep influence on that community. Both my grandfathers came from Scotland, and I don't think they ever really met, but they came from very different backgrounds. The one was a working class tradesman, and the other one was a professional man, a doctor, a medical doctor. As I say, I never knew the medical doctor. He died when I was very small. But what I do need to say about my father and my grandfather, who fought in the First and the Second World War, my grandfather joined up, and he joined the South African Army. He was a Scotsman living in South Africa, but he joined the South African Army, and he was sent to East Africa. He got very ill in East Africa, as did most of the troops during that campaign. Enteric fever, malaria, all sorts of things. And eventually he was sent back. He was up there for quite a while, and he saw a fair amount of action. He was an infantryman. And prior to that, he'd been in the, he'd participated in the Zulu Rebellion of 1906. So he had military experience. He was a sergeant, and he was in charge of a machine gun company, or he was in a machine gun company. He had a section of machine gunners, but he was sent back, and he was demobilized as medically unfit for further service. So he immediately went and joined the King's African Rifles, which was not a South African unit. It was a British colonial unit. And he served, they apparently had either had lesser medical requirements, or else they never knew about his previous medical discharge, because they accepted him and he was again made a sergeant, and he was sent back to East Africa, and he continued the war in East Africa. But he joined up a second time because he believed that it was his duty to fight for his country. And he believed that sincerely. And as a young boy, I can remember the old man. He was quite sickly at that stage. And I can remember him when he would speak to me. The one thing that he would impress upon me, it was duty. It's your duty, your country, your duty to your country. And that was constantly being impressed on me by my grandfather. My father was an epileptic. He was an epileptic from the age of about 2. It plagued him his whole life. He constantly had seizures. When the war broke out, he wouldn't be accepted for service because of his epilepsy. He then hid the epilepsy. I don't know how he did it. Perhaps the fact that his father was a doctor enabled him to get medication or whatever. But he hid the fact that he was an epileptic, and he joined the Rand Light Infantry, and he served with them. But he wasn't able to go up north with them because while he was still training with them, he'd only been with them for about 2 months, he had a seizure on parade. And so his epilepsy was discovered. And he was immediately hospitalized, and when he was diagnosed, he was medically discharged. A matter of days after that, he went to the South African Engineering Corps recruiting station, and he joined up. Obviously, in those days, they didn't have computers, so medical records took a while to get anywhere, and nobody knew about his epilepsy. This time, he managed to hide it far better. He completed his training. He went up north. He served in the 5th Field Company at the Battle of Sidi Rezegh, which was a disastrous battle for the 5th South African Brigade, which was basically annihilated. The 5th Field Company, which my father was a part of, was about 260 men strong. At the end of the battle, less than 100 of them were left. The others had all been killed, wounded, or captured. My father was one of those who was left. And he continued to serve in the next few operations that took place. And then one evening in the tent, he had a seizure. And it was a very bad seizure. His friends who knew about his condition and who were covering up for him thought he was dying. So they called the medics. And he was hospitalized, and they said, no way. They sent him back to South Africa, and he was again medically discharged. I think this had a huge influence on my father's life. He felt that he was being denied the opportunity to serve his country. And he really wanted to serve his country. So both he and my grandfather had volunteered twice. On both occasions, when they had every reason not to go back, they went back because they believed it was their duty. And I grew up with that being imbued in me. It was something which was taught to me in a way that it was like second nature to me. It was something that I couldn't doubt. So that gives you some idea of where I came from. I chopped and changed schools, and we moved around a great deal. I changed schools 8 times before I finally matriculated. My father fell into alcoholism. He lost the farm. He lost everything that he had. His health deteriorated. He was in a very bad way. And I very sincerely believe that what happened to him in the Second World War, the fact that he was not allowed to continue serving, to continue fighting for his country, had a huge effect on him. I remember that I was with him in Bloemhof the day that probably about 1956, 57, took them a long time to issue the medals for the Second World War. And his medals arrived in the post. And he was given the 1939, 1945 Star, the Africa Star, the Africa Service Medal, and the War Medal. And when those 4 medals arrived, and he opened the package, he looked at them for a long time. And there were tears in his eyes. And he turned to me and he said, I didn't think they'd give me these. I didn't think I was good enough. Those medals hold a special place in my heart. We spent a lot of our time in boarding school, my sister and I. One holiday with my wife, my mother, the other holiday with my father. The holidays with my father were not always pleasant because of his alcoholism, because of his epilepsy, because he had nowhere for us to stay. We would have to stay with other people, and he would visit us during the day. But I had a deep respect for my father. Life didn't treat him fairly. It didn't treat him well. But he never lost his firm belief in duty. My mother remarried. The man who became my stepfather was also an alcoholic. I spent my high school years trying to avoid being at home because of the alcohol abuse. At the age of 16, I made a decision that I'm not going to drink alcohol. And I've stuck to that. I don't have a grudge against alcohol. But for all I know, I might be an alcoholic, only I'm never going to find out. And that's been my approach all these years. I don't think any alcoholic starts off wanting to be an alcoholic. So I found myself in a very unhappy domestic situation. I won't say I got mixed up in the wrong crowd, because the friends I had were not bad guys, but we got up to a lot of nonsense. I was in trouble with the police on a number of occasions. We would trash places. We were just frustrated. My closest friend was facing very similar home circumstances to mine. We found a lot in common with one another, and we really didn't know how to give vent to our energies. So we tended to do the wrong things. I did disastrously at school, really, really badly. Both of us. We were in standard 8 at that stage, grade 10, I think it is now. We both failed miserably. I think of the 7 subjects that I wrote, I only passed 2, and that was English and Afrikaans. So I was on a downhill slide at that stage. We didn't want to write our exams, so we ran away from home. We were gone for a few days before we were caught and sent back. and we had to write the exams, but it served no purpose. I had to move school again, move town again. We went back to Boksburg, and I went to Boksburg High, and I was bitterly unhappy at Boksburg High. I'd spent standard 6 and standard 7 at Potch Boys High, at boarding school, and I was blissfully happy. I enjoyed that school like very few people probably enjoy their school life. It was a wonderful experience to me. I had wonderful friends. The teachers were outstanding. The opportunities that existed were manifold. And I really enjoyed being at Potch. But then my stepfather moved us down to Durban, and I found myself at a school which had been a very good school once, Mansfield High, which was a boys' school, not a boarding school though. But it had deteriorated, and it consisted mainly of the Beach Boy crowd, and we hadn't quite reached the hippie stage yet, but if there were hippies, I'm sure they would have gone to Mansfield. It was a rough school, and it was a rough time that I had there, and it was a sort of a kill or be killed situation. You either subsided and were submerged in the culture, or you fought back and you survived. And my friend and I fought back, and we survived, but we were constantly in trouble. While I was at Boksburg High, my schoolwork just kept going downhill. There was not much chance of me getting anywhere. My stepfather wanted me to leave school and take on a trade. I wasn't anxious to do that. I knew that I had some capability, some academic capability, and deep down I wanted to develop that. And I didn't see that going into a trade was going to give me that opportunity. But at the same time, I wasn't pulling my weight at school. I was not trying. I was doing the wrong things, and I was just not getting anywhere. And the teachers had written me off. The headmaster had written me off. They could only say nasty things about me. They constantly told me that I was not going to make it in life. I was never going to get anywhere. I was quite frankly, I was very unhappy at Boksburg High. It was not a happy part of my life at all. Then one night I had a physical fight with my stepfather. Fortunately, he was drunk, and I say fortunately because he had been a Natal boxing champion in his youth, and he knew how to handle his fists. I certainly didn't. But as I say, fortunately, he was drunk, and I came close to killing him that night. Fortunately, again, I didn't. But I basically had to leave home. He did manage to break the cartilage in my nose, and for a long time I had a very painful nose. But I had to leave home. I had to leave school. I went and got a standard 8 certificate. I've still got that in my files. It's not something I would be proud to show anybody. I certainly wouldn't give anybody a job with a certificate like that. And I struggled to get a job. I tried around. I tried various places, but there wasn't anything going other than for me to take a very menial laboring job, or to enter a trade. But even entering a trade, I needed somewhere to stay. And as a tradesman, as an apprentice, what you earned wouldn't cover your boarding costs. And I had nowhere to go to. I was relying on a friend to look after me. I went down to see my father. My father was in an advanced stage of alcoholism. He didn't fully understand or appreciate the situation I was in. He couldn't really offer me any help. And then his brother, who was a businessman in Christiana, got hold of me and said to me, "Why don't you go back to school?" And I said, "Well, who's going to pay for me to go back to school? You got to pay. You got to. Where am I going to stay?" He said, "If you agree to work hard, I will put you in school and I'll pay for you." That sounded like a good deal to me. So I said, "Thank you, I'll do that." But I was pretty obnoxious as a teenager, and I was quite arrogant. I then had the temerity to say to him, "But I'll only go back to school if I can go back to Potch Boys High." Now, I'd been out of Potch Boys High for more than 2 years at that stage. He phoned Potch Boys High, and the headmaster said, "Look, I can accept him at the school, but we don't have room for him in the hostel. If you can find somewhere for him to board in the town, then he can come back to school." So I knew a Portuguese family in Potch. I knew them very well, mainly because they had twin daughters, and I was very soft at one stage on the one daughter. And I said, "I'm sure they will put me up." So he phoned the lady, and she said, "Yes, okay, I can come and stay there." So I had a place to stay and I had a school to go to, and I went back to school. I'd been out of school at that stage for, I can't quite remember, maybe 3 months or so. When I went back, I was now in Standard 9, almost halfway through Standard 9. I had to change my subjects, and it was quite a daunting prospect. But I had this agreement with my uncle, and I was determined to make it work. The concept of duty was coming out. So I worked, and I worked hard. And by the end of that year, I was coming second in my class. And I was at the prize giving, I was awarded a certificate of merit. And I was awarded a book prize for diligence. Now, 9 months before that, if you'd said that to the headmaster and the teachers at Boksburg High, they would have laughed you out of the room. But I was happy because I was back at the school that I wanted to be at. I was back with the friends that I loved. I was back with teachers who believed in me and who were prepared to go the extra mile with me. And they really did. They went out of their way. It was an unbelievable school. It was an old school. It had been established in 1906. It was one of the Milner schools. So it had a black mark against it in the sense that Lord Milner was the man who was responsible for the founding of the school. There were a number of Milner schools. There was King Edward VII School in Johannesburg. There was the Pretoria Boys High School. There was Jeppe Boys High School. And there was Potch. One headmaster established 3 of those schools, Pretoria Boys High and Jeppe Boys High. And when he was asked to establish the last of them, which was Potch, he decided that that's where he wanted to stay. He wanted to bring his children up in a small town. And so he stayed in Potch, and he spent a great deal of time and effort building the school into what it became. He was an Oxford graduate. He was a Scotsman. He was essentially part of the Milner kindergarten. The Oxford and Cambridge dons who were imported into South Africa by Milner and placed in strategic positions in the Transvaal with the specific intention of educating the vanquished Afrikaners so that they would become loyal and competent servants of the new state, the new colony that was being built up there. In effect, this backfired on Milner, because many of the Afrikaners took that opportunity. And at Potch, we had almost a tradition of Afrikaans-speaking boys who attended the school. And many of them, their grandfathers and their fathers had attended the school. And they took the opportunity that was offered by Milner and sent their kids there, because they took the view, as jy die Engelse wil wen, moet jy hulle verstaan. En as jy hulle wil verstaan, moet jy hulle taal ken. En as jy hulle taal wil ken, dan moet jy by na hulle skool toe gaan. So they never lost their independence and their spirit of individualism as Afrikaners, but they absorbed the beneficial aspects of the English culture. And many of them did go on to prominent positions in the Transvaal administration in the years that came. But very few of them were fans of the British Empire. So this is the situation I found myself in at Potch. And Potch Boys High was a melting pot in many ways. And in that sense, I'm pleased that I didn't actually finish my schooling at an Afrikaans school, because at an Afrikaans school, it tended to be very homogeneous. Whereas at Potch Boys High, we had a very, very heterogeneous composition. One must remember, this was the early 1960s, early to mid 1960s. There was at that stage a significant influx of Portuguese-speaking people from Mozambique into South Africa. And in Potch, we had a strong Portuguese community, and many of the boys all went to Potch Boys High. So we all had Portuguese friends. There was a very strong Greek community in Potch, and all of those Greek boys went to Potch Boys High. And so we all had Greek friends. I played rugby with Greek boys. I played rugby with Portuguese boys. And then we had this strong percentage. I'd say probably a good 30% of the boys at Potch were from Afrikaans backgrounds. So it was very much a mixture of people. And then there was another element at the school, which was particularly valuable, certainly to me. And that is that in the Platteland, because one must remember that Potch Boys High was the only boarding school in the Western Transvaal. From when you went west of Johannesburg, the only boarding school was at Potch Boys High and Potch Girls High. And all the little villages and towns in the Western Transvaal had small Jewish communities. They played a vital role in the business sector within these little towns. And those Jewish families, most of them, sent their sons to Potch Boys High. So we had a large number of Jewish boys at the school. And that's why I say, in a sense, it was a melting pot. And it made us aware of other boys, of other nationalities, of other cultures. We didn't all go to the NG church. There were certainly some who did, because they came from an Afrikaans background. Most of the guys probably went to the Methodist church, but there were a significant number that went to the Anglican church. And with the Portuguese guys there were quite a lot who went to the Catholic church. So even in the religious sphere, although we had to go to church on Sundays, except the Jewish boys, they went to shul on a Saturday. But everybody had to go, it was compulsory. But you went to different churches, and it was okay, it was not a problem. And in fact, what I remember is that I was not a committed Christian at that stage. And what I do remember about the church parade at school was that my denomination tended to vary depending on who my current girlfriend was and what church she went to. So if she was an Anglican, I went to the Anglican church because that gave me a chance to see her after church. And if she was a Catholic, then I was quite happy to go to the Catholic church. And after Mass, I could stand and chat to her. And so it went. And with many of the guys, this was the case. We had perhaps a very liberal approach to culture, to religion, to people. And yet the school espoused extremely important and prominent traditional values, and they were mainly conservative values. So discipline was extremely important, and discipline was applied. And it was applied in the school in a way that it was largely self-discipline. You were taught from when you were in standard 6, in your first year in high school, you were taught that if you've done something wrong, you own up and you take the consequences. That was taught. It was accepted. And you, if somebody had got up to some nonsense and the teacher walked in and said, "Who did that?" "I did, sir." "See me in my office." And then you bent over and got your backside tanned. That's the way it worked. You took responsibility for your actions. But every action had a consequence. And if you'd had been responsible for that action, then you had to take the consequences. And we grew up with that, and we accepted it, and we had no problem with it. It was the way life was conducted at the school. And we even had the point where the teachers would close their eyes to certain practices because they felt that these practices were good for our growth. For instance, when a boy was appointed as a prefect in matric, each hostel we had 3 hostels, and each hostel was an entity on its own. You entered the hostel in standard 6 and you left it in matric. So you were in that hostel throughout. And the hostels were Milton, Granton, and Buxton. Granton was the oldest one. It was established by C.D. Hope, who was the principal of the school, and it used the colors of Oxford University. And Granton was the town that he came from in Scotland, and that's what it was called. The second hostel that was built was called Milton, and the senior housemaster there was a Cambridge graduate. So Milton had the colors of Cambridge University. And Milton was the second name of that housemaster, so it became Milton. And later there was Buxton. And these houses each had a culture of their own. And when you were appointed a prefect at the school, you were a prefect in the school, but you were also a prefect in the hostel. And the prefect's will was law in the hostel. And the teachers, the housemasters, they just monitored that to make sure that these guys didn't get out of hand or go overboard. So if you were guilty of doing something, I remember I wasn't a prefect in matric, but I remember one of my best friends was the head prefect of our hostel. And I remember doing something wrong in matric once. And he called me into his study. And I'd known this guy since primary school. We'd been friends since primary school. We were very good friends. He died just 2 years ago, and we were close friends right up to the day he died. He said to me, "Alec, what you've done, I've got to send you to the boss for that. And he's going to tan your backside for you. And your name will go down in the black book." Because the headmaster kept a black book of all the guys who were punished and what their punishments were. He said, "But and I can't leave it undone." He said, "But I'll give you a choice. You can let me tan you, and it stays between you and me." So I bent over and I said, "Go ahead, Eric." And he tanned my backside for me. This was my buddy. And I got up and I said, thank you. And I walked out, and that was it. This was part of the culture that existed at the school. This was part of the essence of taking responsibility and of making decisions and of assessing a situation. This was encouraged in the school, and I loved it. I thrived in that school. At the end of my standard 9 year, the headmaster called me in, and he said to me, I've been very impressed with your work, and I believe that you've got a lot of potential. There is a place available in Milton Hostel. I'd like to offer you that place. But if you decide to remain a day boy and stay with the people that you're staying with in Potch at this stage, I'm prepared to make you a prefect. If you decide to go to the hostel, I can't make you a prefect because that would be unfair to the guys who've been in the hostel all the time. Choice is yours. You come to the hostel, you're welcome. And he was the headmaster, the chief, the senior housemaster in that hostel. So I was very chuffed that he was offering me a place in his hostel. He said, but if you choose to remain a day boy, I make you a prefect. I said to him, sir, you don't give me any choice. I want to go to the hostel. And I did. My year in matric was probably one of the finest years of my life. I will never forget it. I'll never regret a day that I spent in matric. It was a magnificent year. Fortunately, at that stage of my life, I was maintaining a diary daily. And I've got a record of every day as I was in the hostel that year. So that's essentially my background to Potch Boys High. My feeling about the school. The school has changed drastically, radically in recent years, as have many schools. Unfortunately, not always for the best. But the school that I remember is the school that I remember. That's the school that changed my life. That's the school that gave me an opportunity. That's the school that made me believe in myself. At the end of the matric year, at the prize giving, I was given a prize which was a cash prize. It was awarded by a very prominent man in Potchefstroom many years ago. He was dead by then. And it was a sort of a bursary that was awarded every year. Not a great deal of money, but when you had as little as I had, it was worth having. It was awarded to for conscientious effort throughout the school year, the C.V. Bate Award. And I was so proud of that award, that I was actually given that award. Many years later, a friend of mine living in Potch, I was visiting him in his house, and he said, they closed down the Potchefstroom Club some years ago, and I found an interesting entry in the visitors book from 1906. I said, yes. He said, have a look. And I had a look. And there, my grandfather had stayed in the Potchefstroom Club in 1906 and had signed the visitors register. And there was Dr. W. Alexander. And I said, wow, that's amazing. And I looked through the other names on that page. And on that same page, there was C.V. Bate had stayed in the Potchefstroom Club. His name on that same page. And he's the guy who donated the prize that I won when I was in matric. So with that amazing, I won't call it a coincidence, but with that amazing phenomenon, this guy said, tear the page out, you can keep it. I said to him, no, you can't damage a book like this. You can't tear the page out. So I left it. And A few months later, I got something in the post, and it was that page had been carefully removed and framed and sent to me, and I've got it hanging in my wall now. So the school has a special place in my heart. The people have a special place in my heart. The teachers have a special place in my heart. We had an Afrikaans teacher who'd been at the school for, at that stage, 45 years. He started his teaching career at the school. His name was Jerry Smith. He taught Afrikaans with a passion that you cannot believe. And on the walls of his classroom, he had framed photographs of all the Afrikaans literati, the poets, the authors, Sangiro, C.J. Langenhoven, C.M. van den Heever. All of those guys, their photograph and a little biography of them and a list of the works that they had produced. I remember those framed photographs so clearly. That teacher had a way of teaching us Afrikaans that hierdie klomp Engelsmanne was lief vir Afrikaans. We enjoyed going to the Afrikaans class. It was something great for us because of his passion. So I'm extremely grateful for that. Our school had a practice. Every Wednesday, our school assembly would be in Afrikaans. The other days it was in English, but on a Wednesday it was always in Afrikaans. And that included singing Afrikaans hymns and praying in Afrikaans. So, I learned off by heart to sing Op Berge en Dale and all the other songs that we used to sing, hymns we used to sing I think it had a deep impact on me. In later years, people said to me, why didn't you go to England and join the British Army? I said to them, why would I want to do that? This is my country. These are my people. This is where I want to be. So that's the way it worked. Unfortunately, I had a fallout with my uncle because of my teenage arrogance. I wanted to go on a hitchhiking race around the country. I'd been hitchhiking since I was 15 years old to get away from the home. I didn't want to be at home. So I used to spend every holiday, every long weekend, hitchhiking and camping in the mountains, either on my own or with my friends. And there was this hitchhiking race around South Africa, a 3,000-mile hitchhiking race being held around South Africa for schoolboys. And I wanted to go on this. And my uncle sent me a message and he said, we've made all the arrangements. You'll be staying with so-and-so when you come up for the holidays so your father can see you and so on. And so I wrote back to him and I said, that's not our agreement. Our agreement was, I work hard at school, you pay for me. You got my report. I'm working hard at school. I'm doing my side of the deal. Holidays are mine. We said nothing about the holidays. I go where I want to during the holidays. My uncle, kyk, ek is baie keer hardkoppig. Maar is omdat my familie hardkoppig is. Hy was net so hardkoppig. So he said to me, you come and stay with us for the holidays or I stop paying for you. I went on a hitchhiking race and the money dried up. So I had to find money elsewhere. My mother helped me occasionally. She would send me money when she could, which wasn't all that often. I had friends who helped me. I should have been finished school already when I was in matric because I'd failed a year. So quite a few of my friends had gone to do their military service. And I had a friend, my closest friend, who was in the Air Force gym. They used to earn around about 8 Rand a month in the Air Force gym. At the end of every month, he would hitchhike down to Potch and give me R5. Now, that gives you some sort of idea. This Afrikaans teacher that I told you about, he used to say to me, at the end of an Afrikaans lesson, he'd say to me, Alexander, ek wil hê jy moet net agterbly. And all the guys would file out and the bell went. And then I'd come up to him and he'd look at me, he'd put his hand in his pocket and he'd pull out a handful of loose change. And he'd take my hand and he'd put it in my hand and he'd say, vat hierdie, spandeer dit op yourself. He did that. He knew my position. He never came and sympathized with me. He never gave me long stories or anything. He just gave me a handful of coins. And that meant a great deal to me. That enabled me to do certain things which I otherwise couldn't. I had no pocket money in the pocket money book, which we could sign out for pocket money every Saturday and draw 20 cents or 50 cents or whatever. My page was blank on the first day and it was blank on the last day. I never had money to put in the pocket money book. So in the bank that the teacher used to control. So we had a film show on a Saturday evening, and it cost 5 cents to attend the film show. I didn't have 5 cents. I couldn't attend the film show. And the head prefect would, on a Friday in the prep room, he'd say, all right, these guys have all paid, you can go to the film tomorrow night. And he'd read out the names. And every Friday, my name would be there. And I'd go to him and I'd say, Derek, I never paid. And he'd say to me, it's been paid. And I'd say, who paid? He'd say, that's not your concern. It's been paid. You go to the movie. I found out 40 years later that there was a guy from Lichtenburg, Bok Bosman, Afrikaans guy. He used to pay for me every week. He never told me. Derek knew because he had to pay Derek the money. But nobody knew. But he did it every week. He never told me that. He never, when I found out about it, Bok had already died. I was never able to go to him and say, Bok, thanks for what you did. But that's what the guys did. They did those things. The guys would invite me home over weekends. If there was a long weekend, if there were school holidays, they'd invite me to their home for a while. I had such good friends, and they would help me. The school secretary called me into her office, and she said, when her son had finished school there about 5 years earlier, she said, my son's suit that he used to use doesn't fit him anymore. It's in perfect condition. I want you to have it. I got a basically brand new suit. It was wonderful. We had to have a suit to go to school, to go to church on a Sunday. I didn't know how I was going to get to church on a Sunday because I didn't have a suit. She gave me the suit. And so the guys helped me, the people helped me, the teachers helped me. The English teacher used to, every time there was something that was needed, there were things that were known as College of Careers. It was a study guide for your set work book, but they cost. I don't think they cost much, 50 cents or R1 or something, but they cost, and I didn't have the money. But English was really one of my favorite subjects, and I really wanted to have those study guides. She would take the people's money in and she'd order the study guides. And when they'd come, she'd take them and she'd put them on all the desks of all the guys who'd ordered one, and she'd put one on my desk. And I'd say to her, ma'am, I didn't order one. And she'd just smile at me. She paid for it. The teachers believed in me. They believed that I could do things. And they encouraged me. So I'll never forget my time at Potch Boys High. I finished matric. There were two things about finishing matric. The one was when my matric results came, I got a first-class matric and 2 distinctions, English and history. I would never have believed that would have been possible. I got it. But that's thanks to the school. The school made that possible. And by the school, I'm not talking about the buildings. I'm talking about the people. And the other thing about matric that I remember is I wrote my last matric exam. It was the last exam that was being written of all the matric exams. So other guys who'd finished their subjects and so on, they'd already left and so on, but it was the last day of school and the last exam. I wrote that last exam and I went up to the hostel and collected my things. And I had to leave. And I realized this is my home. And now I'm on my own. I can't come back. I can never come back here now. I'm finished. This incredible year that I've had is over. Now I'm on my own. And that was a very, very sobering thought. So what must I do? What am I going to do with myself? I had decided already in Standard 9 that I'm going to go join the army. Why did I do that? Because I knew I didn't have anywhere to live. I didn't have anywhere where any support base. I didn't have anything. The army could offer me all of that, and I wouldn't have to beg people anymore. I wouldn't have to rely on other people to help me. But there was a deeper meaning than that. Even the year before that, I had been wondering about the military, because of all the stories I'd heard about the army and about my family who'd served in the army and about how things had been in the army. And I was reading a great deal, and I would read about the Second World War, and I would read about what people had done in the military. And I would think, this is the sort of thing that I would enjoy doing, because I loved camping. I loved hiking. I loved being in the outdoors. And then an aunt of mine went over to England, and she married a Scotsman, and they came back to South Africa. And lo and behold, this guy had been a British paratrooper. And he started telling me about the paratroops. Well, the year before that, when one parachute battalion had just been established, and they first started training when they extended national service. It wasn't really national service because it was a ballot system. And they extended the ballot from being 2 months, it was extended to 9 months. And that meant that they could now train those ballotees as paratroopers. And it was advertised and appeared in magazines and so on. And my friend and I, who had to now go and register to be called up when we turned 16, we both said, the paratroops, that's where we must go. We both decided that's where we must go. But it was just a thought. But after talking to this uncle of mine and listening to his tales about the paratroopers and what he did in the paratroopers, I'm quite sure that he embellished those tales tremendously, and there were a lot of big stories about it. But I just loved it. I used to hang on to every word that he spoke, and he used to take me camping. And and then we'd sit around the campfire at night, and we'd hike up into the mountains and sit around the campfire, and he'd tell me stories about the paratroops. And I just became obsessed with the idea. I want to become a paratrooper. So I thought about it, and I thought, what I don't like about the South African Army is the way that they are so anti-British. They want to get rid of all the British traditions. They want to close down the Scottish regiments. They want to. At one stage, there was a huge movement afoot to ban the wearing of kilts in the early 1960s. And I wrote letters to the press, and they were published, objecting to this. Why? How dare they want to, take away the Transvaal Scottish kilts and things like that. I just had this love of tradition, and I really wanted to be able to get back to, or to be in a military that had a proper tradition. So I was reading through a book, and I saw some stuff about the Rhodesian Army. So I wrote to the Rhodesian Army and I told them I'm interested in joining. And they wrote back and they said to me, we're glad to hear this, but we see you're still at school. We want to suggest that you complete your matric and then appear before an officer selection board, and then we will consider you joining the Rhodesian Army. And they sent me all the stuff. I've still got all that stuff that they sent me in the early 1960s of the Rhodesian Army. It was, when I started off, it was still the Federation, and then it became Southern Rhodesia, and then I wrote to them and I said, yeah, but I want to join. I want to become a paratrooper. So they wrote back to me and they said, we have a unit called the Special Air Service. It's a paratroop unit and a very good paratroop unit. If you're good enough, you can join it. So I thought, I'm going to be good enough. I'm going to join it. And I was very enthusiastic about this. And in matric, I managed to get appointed as a platoon sergeant in the Milton Senior Cadet Platoon. And so for the passing out parade, I was on parade as a sergeant. And I was very chuffed with myself about this. And most of the guys, they didn't fancy this cadet business. And, they did it, but it did it because you had to. It wasn't a great thing. And the whole concept of call-ups, everybody had to register, but only about 40% of the guys were actually called up. 45% were actually called up they were balloted and called up. And I made it well known in all my friends, I'm going to join the Rhodesian Army, but I'll wait until I'm called up. I'll first do the South African parachute course, and then when I'm finished my 9 months, I'll go up to Rhodesia and join the Rhodesian Army. And I'll appear before a selection board and see if I can become an officer and go to the SAS. And the guys used to all laugh at me. Came the end of the year, I wasn't balloted. So I wasn't called up. But to add to that, on the 11th of November, 1965, when I was busy writing matric, Rhodesia declared UDI. And my father was as I said before, he was a bloedsop, but more than that, worse, he was a royalist. And he was a dyed-in-the-wool royalist. And he hated living in a republic. And when he heard that I'm going to go to Rhodesia and join these rebels against the crown, he said, I'm not giving you my permission. Yeah. Anyway, I thought, well, maybe I can persuade him not to change his mind. But I'm going to go and do my 9 months first. He wasn't very happy about me doing my 9 months because it was in a Republican army. So, he wasn't happy about that. But he knew that, if I was called up, I had to go. And then I wasn't balloted. So I thought, well, I'm going to go straight to Rhodesia. But he wouldn't give his permission. I thought, well, I'll get my mother to give her permission. She was prepared to give her permission, but just at that point, there was a major crisis in our family, which concerned my sister. And I had to find some way of being close by. She was still at school. And our whole domestic life had collapsed completely. I had no family life to speak of anymore. But I did want to rescue my sister from disaster. Not that I could do anything or that I managed to do anything. But I decided I can't go to Rhodesia. But now I've got to get a job. And I did. I got a job training guide dogs for the blind. I was very fortunate to get the job because it included accommodation. It included full board and lodging. It included a clothing allowance. And of course, it gave me a salary. I was only an apprentice, so it wasn't a big salary, but I had a place to stay. It was in Joburg, and it was in a magnificent estate. It was a very nice place. I had a room up in a loft, which was beautiful, suited me wonderfully. And I did that for almost 2 years. And during that time, I worked under a man who had a profound influence on me. Lionel Wilson was his name. He was the chief trainer. He taught me a great deal about dogs and about training dogs, but more importantly, he taught me a lot about people. Because what you had to do with the Guide Dog Association was you trained the dogs. It took you about 4 months to train a dog, 4 to 6 months to train a dog, and you trained several of them at once. Once they were trained, then the blind people would come to the training center, and they would stay there for a month, 28 days, working 7 days a week with the dog. Initially in the training center, and then taking them out onto the streets and gradually sending them on bigger and bigger trips and so on. And the skill lay not so much in training the dogs. That's not a difficult thing to do. The skill lay in matching the dogs with the people and understanding the people and working with the people. And at that stage, I'd always been fond of animals. I'd always loved animals, particularly wild animals, but I had a particular passion for dogs as well. So I was very pleased to get this job. And I was very fortunate to get it. But I realized for the first time while I was doing that job that my actual interest was people. That's what I really focused on, what I felt I needed to focus on. I did that job for, as I say, almost 2 years. But all the time, I was hankering for the military. And the worst of it was that my friends from school, who didn't particularly want to go to the military, they were called up and they went and did their 9 months. And some of them went to the gymnasiums. And some of those who did their 9 months volunteered for the paratroops. And they got their wings. And they were so chuffed with themselves. And I was kicking myself because here I was training dogs. And I wanted to be a paratrooper. And these guys were becoming paratroopers and they were doing these exciting things. And here I was sitting in this job. So I really need to do something about it. And I realized if I don't do something soon, it's going to be too late. My boss decided to break away from the Guide Dog Association and start doing private dog training. And he offered me a job with him, training dogs. So I was getting bored with the dog training at the Guide Dog Association. So I took the job. I resigned and I took the job and I went to work for him. But I'd only been with him for a little over a month. And he came to me and he said, listen, I'm running into a cash flow problem with a new job. Is there any way you can get another job for a few months just to tide me over? And then you can come back. When I got the cash flow problem sorted out, then we can go on with this new business. And it was a good business. His dog, he ran a kennels and a dog training system. It had good potential, and he made a great success of it in the end. But I said to him, I think I can get something. And I had a little Vespa scooter, and I jumped onto that scooter, and I drove straight out to Pretoria. And I went to the recruiting office, and I said, I want to do my 9 months. And they said, no, we're recruiting permanent force here. You've got to go to this place. So I went off to another place. And the guy said, you want to volunteer? So I said, yes, I want to volunteer. I want to do my 9 months. I want to go to the paratroops. They said, well, first of all, you got to do basics. So I said, well, I'll do basics, but I want to go. Can I go now? They said there's an intake starting in 2 weeks' time. It was the October intake. They said starting in 2 weeks' time. Will you be able to go on that? So I said yes. So they scratched around. They battled to find the right papers and so on because people didn't generally volunteer to do their 9 months training. But within, I think it was about 3 days, I got a telegram saying, "You've been allocated to the Rand Light Infantry, and you will be leaving on the 2nd of October or whatever from the drill hall in Johannesburg to go to 1 SA Infantry Training Battalion in Oudtshoorn." So I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled. This was wonderful. Of course, it meant a major adjustment for me, because I'd now been a civvy for 2 years. I was wearing a heavy beard. My hair was not exactly short, and I had all these bad civvy habits. A lot of them revolved around girls. I had some wonderful girlfriends, and I was very, very disappointed that I was going to have to leave them in Joburg and go down to Oudtshoorn. But it's only for 9 months. It'll be worth it. So I had to shave off my beard and cut my hair and so on. And some of my mates drove me to the drill hall and dropped me there with great jollity and mirth to see me going off 2 years after they did, to go and do my, in some cases, 3 years after them, to go and do my 9 months. And I got on the troop train and trundled down to Oudtshoorn, and had a very rude awakening when I arrived in Oudtshoorn, because I discovered that the corporals are probably the most unpleasant people in the world. I also found that the military had no consideration for me and my particular foibles and fancies. From Oudtshoorn, you look out onto the Swartberg Mountains, and that particular section of the Swartberg Mountains is particularly impressive. It's where the Swartberg Pass goes over. And I'd been up into the Swartberg Mountains on previous occasions when I'd been hitchhiking, and I loved the area. And I wanted to get up into those mountains. But I had to march on the parade ground, and I had to square my bed, and I had to stand inspection, and I had to run around in the veld with an R1. Of course, I was very excited to get an R1 rifle. It was wonderful. I loved the musketry and the fieldcraft and those sort of subjects. I didn't particularly enjoy the marching. It wasn't a big problem to me because I'd done cadets, and marching was quite. I knew how to march, but I hated the inspections, and I hated the preparing for inspections, and we didn't get passes. They didn't give us any passes. The only time we got out was on a Sunday, and then it was just to the church parade. And the Afrikaans guys didn't even get out on a Sunday because they had an NG service in the church, in the camp. So they had to sit there through the NG service. But those of us who were anything else, and I would swap. For 1 week I'd be Catholic, and 1 week I'd be Methodist, and 1 week, and so every week I'd go to a different church, and I'd scout out and look at the girls in the choir and so on, and see which one had the best talent, and then that's the one that I'd keep going to. But you never, at the end of the service, Bedford would be waiting outside, and you'd have to go and hop into the Bedford, and off you go. So I was not very happy with all of this. But anyhow, I started a driver's course. My father had been a driver in the engineers, and so I thought I'll do the driver's course. I remember the vehicle that we were trained on was an old Ford Centiweight, Second World War Ford Centiweight. Now, the peculiar thing about the Ford Centiweight was that it had the clutch and the brake, but the accelerator was in between the clutch and the brake. So you had to have and I mean, I was driving at that stage. I knew how to drive, but you had to keep your wits about you that you didn't jam the brake when you wanted to put your foot on the accelerator. It was a terrible old thing, a snub-nosed type of vehicle. Anyway, I did the first part of the driver's course there, and then they arrived to select the paratroops. And I was so uptight, so excited about this lot. And they came along, and a fellow called Major Buddy Ferreira came along. This wasn't the famous Dion Ferreira, but Dion Ferreira was a Veldkornet or a lieutenant at that stage, and he was my company commander. I was in driver company, and he was my company commander. But we only saw him on a Friday when there was inspection. Other than that, we never saw him. But the paratroopers arrived, and what I remember is we were busy we were living in tents, and the tents were opposite the big hangars where they had the quartermaster stores, and there was a big open concrete slab between us and the hangars, and we were busy in our scruffy khaki overalls, busy making mud walls around the tents and preparing for another inspection. And suddenly we heard singing. And it was this loud singing. And there was one guy who would shout something, and then the other would sing after him. But it was a marching, it was in double time, singing at a marching rate, a double time marching rate. And we heard this, and we saw a squad turn around at the bottom of this long concrete slab, and these guys come doubling up the concrete road, singing, and they had maroon berets on, and you sort of heard a ripple going through the company of the guys saying, "Dis die bats, dis die parabats, dis die bats." And everybody ran to the edge to have a look. And these guys came past. Man, I'd never seen anything like that in my life. They were in perfect unity. There was no one in charge of them. They were just running. There was nobody in charge. There were corporals amongst them, but everybody was in the squad. And they were jogging past in double time. And one guy would sing something, and he'd call out something, and then the others would repeat it. And they would go, and their heads were all held high, and they didn't look left or right. And we felt like scruffy, dirty little pieces of rubbish on the edge of this concrete slab. And these guys went past. And the singing sort of got softer and softer as they went up towards the mess. And I thought to myself, I've got to go there. I've got to become a paratrooper. Whatever happens, I've got to become a paratrooper. And the next day, they called us all out, gave us a talk in what they called I think they called it the YMCA. It was a big hall that we used to gather in. And all the troops were gathered together there, and this major gave us a talk on the paratroops. And then he said, now he's going to take us all outside, and we're going to watch them do a jump. And we all went out North Gate, and we all lined up sat down in the veld there. We were sitting there, and this Dakota came flying through. And it came along past us, turned right round, and came back again. And this time it came down, and it came much lower. And it came over, and the guy came into the door. The door was open. And the next minute he went out. And another guy behind him. And another guy, and their parachute started opening. And we saw this row of parachutes opening and coming down on the hard felt there. And they landed. And when they landed, these guys bounced up, and they stripped off their harnesses and rolled up their parachutes. And in seconds, they had the parachutes on their backs, and they were running towards the truck that was parked there. Man, these were just different soldiers. They were not like our corporals. They were not like the other roofies in the camp. These were real soldiers. And then the major said, okay, all of you who would like to volunteer for the paratroops, step forward. Yeah, I was first one out. And stacks of the guys stepped forward. And he said, right, the rest of you, you can go. And the other guys who had no intention of becoming paratroopers, they left. So there were a lot of us there. I don't know, maybe two or 300 of us standing there. And he said, "You see that little white building on top of that kopje there?" And he pointed to it was probably about, I don't know, 1.5 kilometers, maybe 2 kilometers away. On this kopje, which was an extension of Butkop, which was where the shooting range was. And it extended out into the training area. Just this tiny little white building. He said, "You all run to that kopje, to that building. We're watching you. You'll go around that building and you'll come back. I'm only taking the first 75 who get back. Go!" And we started to run. Yeah, of course. My lungs burnt that day like I couldn't believe. I ran, ek het soos 'n besete gehardloop. I ran like I was going to, if I didn't come in first, I was going to die. I ran. I didn't come in first, but I was well up ahead. I turned around that little kopje, that little house on the kopje, and I ran back. I was wheezing and puffing and panting, and we were only about, I think, 3 weeks into basic training, maybe a bit more. So we were not particularly fit, but probably a little fitter than we had been. But it was an incredibly hard run, and it was hot. It was real outside. It was summertime. I mean, this was October, November, and we got back. And when we got back, I just collapsed. But I was in the first 75. Easily, I made it. It was no problem. And then they cut off the other guys and they sent the other guys back. And lots of the guys just stopped running. They were long before. They just decided this is not for them. They didn't do it. But they took those 75 and they said, "Okay, it's too hot to continue with the rest of the tests. But you come down to the field and you wait there until the temperature drops." So we went down to the field, and then they went through. After the temperature dropped sufficiently, we had to climb over a wall. We had to do push-ups. We had to do sit-ups. We had to do pull-ups on a bar. We had to do scarp draw. We had to put a guy on our shoulders and run with him. All of these tests. I got through all of them, and so I was selected. I was over the moon. I was so excited. This was the highlight for me. And a few weeks later, we were shipped off to 1 Parachute Battalion. And then I did my rest of my training at 1 Parachute Battalion. I was a rifleman. I was trained as an LMG number 1. And I had excellent training. Outstanding instructors. When we eventually we met up with people from various units around the country that had been selected and were brought through to Bloemfontein, and we completed our basic training there, and then we had our selection course, our 2-week selection course. There were 120 of us who started off on the selection course. And they wanted to get a full company from that. Well, a full company is already about 120. So, they had little chance of doing that. When we'd finished the selection course, the 2-week PT course, and the 3-week hanger course, 48 of us qualified. So it was quite an attrition rate. Quite a lot of the guys did fall off. The selection course was tough. I had a knee problem. I had to report sick on one day, and they gave you a maximum of 2 days off the course. Other than that, then they'd kick you off. But you could, if you had a valid reason for 2 days, they would give you. I had to take those 2 days because my knee was giving me a lot of trouble, but it still gave me trouble right through the course until the last day. And on the last day, we had to do the 6 battle tests. And they were tough. And on that day, the night before, I can remember the night before, I was so despondent because of my knee. I knew I'm never going to make these tests, but let me just do my best. But I was so despondent. I walked outside and I went out into the night on my own. And I thought, I've got to pray now. Only God can get me through this. My knee is giving me such trouble. I'm not going to make it. And I looked up at the sky, and I can remember it so clearly. I looked at the stars. And as I looked at the stars, I thought to myself, I wonder what's beyond that star. And if I could get beyond that star to the next star, what's beyond that star? And as I thought about that, the magnitude of eternity suddenly hit me. And suddenly I realized that there is something like eternity. And eternity is much bigger than me. And I'm this miserable little guy sitting here on planet Earth, a speck of dust. And the God who created this eternity, I'm expecting him to help me get through this little PT course. I thought, no, I'm wasting my time. And I turned around and I walked back into the bungalow. And I thought, what happens, happens. Well, it was a year later that I became a Christian. But at that stage, I wasn't one yet. And I was just lost in the magnitude of eternity. And the next day we had the tests. And there was one test that I could not master. One of those tests, and that was the 7-foot wall, a sheer concrete wall. And you had to get up that with your full marching order. In other words, your full heavy pack and your small packs and your rifle and your steel helmet and your boots. You had to get up that wall. And it was sheer, flat, 7 foot. And I tried during the training and during the course, and I used to go after hours, I used to go and practice and try everything I could try, and every technique that they tried to taught me. I'd get up onto that wall and pull and push and heave and run out of energy and just drop back. And I couldn't make it. The others I would manage. There was what was it? 9 mile, I think it was a 9 mile speed march that we had to do in 18 minutes. I think that's what it was, 5 mile. I can't remember anyway, but it was a tough one. But I used to manage that. You had to do scarp draw, 200 meters of scarp draw, carrying a guy your own weight with all your kit and all his kit and his rifle and your rifle and his helmet and your helmet and his boots and your boots. And you had to do that in 1 minute, 15 seconds. That was tough. That was extremely tough. But I could manage that. There was a rope you had to climb. Full marching order, heavy pack on your back, helmet, boots, rifles. And you had to climb this 25 feet up to the top of the hangar on this rope. Touch the top and then climb back down again. That was tough. But I could manage that. There was a ditch you had to jump across with full kit and so on. I could manage that. So I managed all of the tests except that wall. That wall, that was my nemesis. And they said you can fail one test, but there were 2 you weren't allowed to fail. The one was the speed march and the other was the scarp draw. But you could fail one of the others. So I thought, well, if I can make all the others, then if I fail the wall, I'll still make it. But if you were an officer, you weren't allowed to fail any. Officers had to pass them all. So I've never quite figured that one out. But anyway, but I wasn't an officer. I was just a troop. So it didn't worry me too much. So I went for it. And on that day, I looked at that wall and I ran. And I planted my foot halfway up the wall and I pivoted myself and I sailed right over the top and I was there. And I made all the tests. So I was very, very, very chuffed. And the day that I qualified, and the hangar was tough, but it was good. We were all very fit at that stage. My knee didn't give me trouble anymore. I had an exceptional hangar instructor, Sergeant. He was a staff sergeant then, Frans van Zyl, FCA van Zyl. He was later killed in action with the Rekkies at the Heki. But Frans van Zyl was a wonderful man, an incredible man, and an extremely good instructor. And I remember when I qualified. Remember, they selected the corporals amongst us before we'd actually qualified. We were still busy with our training, and I wasn't one of those selected. And when we went into the mock-ups, and Frans van Zyl was doing aircraft drill with us, and we all got into the mock-ups, and we were sitting there, and he glared at us, and he looked at me and he said, "Alexander." I said, "Ja, Saf." He said, "Hoekom is jy nie 'n korporaal nie?" I said, "Staf, ek kies nie die korporaals nie." So anyway, I wasn't a corporal, so that was it. And then the qualifying jump, our qualifying jump was a kit jump from the C-130. We'd already done our night jump. Usually you qualified on a night jump. It worked a little differently with us. And we had the exceptional situation, the Dakota. There was only one Dakota available, and it kept breaking. And eventually we had been waiting so long to do our jumps that they got an Alouette helicopter in. And we did our first jumps out of the Alouette helicopter, which was an incredible experience. That put me one up on all my buddies who'd already qualified, because none of them had ever jumped out of a helicopter. But my qualifying jump was a kit jump from the C-130 out at De Brugge. And I remember when I landed, I realized I've made it. I've done it. And I was busy folding up my parachute. And as I was busy folding it up, I saw drops falling on the canopy. And I realized I was crying because I was so happy that I'd made it, that I'd actually qualified. And I put the rucksack on my back and I ran back to the truck. And I remember Veldkornet Archie Moore, who later I would have a great deal to do with. But he was our platoon commander, and he was waiting at the truck. And I thought that, he's going to say, "Wel gedaan, Alexander, well done, congratulations, you're a paratrooper now." When I got to the truck, he said to me, "Hoekom het jy so lank gevat? Sit jou valskerm daar neer. Gaan tree aan saam met die ander." There was no time for nonsense. So we were back into the thing of it. We had a great training period. We were trained by excellent instructors. We had a very small company. Our company commander was Captain Frank Besby. He was exceptional. He'd qualified on the Rhodesian SAS selection course. He was an exceptional man. The NCOs we had were absolutely outstanding. So I have only good memories of the time I spent as a paratrooper. And then my training came to an end. To my great disappointment in some ways, but in other ways I was very pleased. We were suddenly informed they've now introduced national service. And for national service, they are going to now, paratroopers, if you volunteer for the paratroopers, you don't just do 9 months, you do a full year, but then you don't have to do any camps. But in order to accommodate this, we've got to clear the base and start getting the new people in. So you guys are not going to do 9 months, you're going to finish after just 7 months. I thought to myself, that's crazy, that can't be so. But that's what happened. We finished after just 7 months and I cleared out. I was sorry to go. I think I finished with about 16 or 18 jumps. So, we still did a fair amount and we did very good training right up to the end. But I was very pleased to be able to go back to my girlfriends in Joburg. And it was going to be another 4 years before I was commissioned in the citizen force and 8 years before I would join permanent force. So, but maybe we'll chat about that another time, of course.
Also, I must tell you, this is probably the most compelling story I've heard on the channel. And I have to be careful how I say this, but my family on my father's side were all supper. The South African party, they were Jan Smith's people. And all my uncles of his generation, all of them fought in the war.
Yeah.
Every single one of them, I had to take their way yet.
The Roy Lissy, yeah.
And sometimes those were hard days, because sometimes I know that these soldiers would walk into a church and the rest would walk out.
Yeah.
They were that angry with each other. So you explaining about the Nats and the Saps taking each other on the first fight, that's entirely true, sir. That's entirely true. We forgot about that. I'm glad you mentioned it. But now I have to ask you something, sir. You have a very interesting decoration in your name. OM. Oscar Mike, I believe.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, I can. It's not actually a decoration as such, but it is I won't say an award. It's a qualification. It's something special. Potchefstroom was built by the old Boere. It was the first capital of the Republic. And it was built in the Mooi River. The spot that was selected was initially, today it's known as Ouderdorp. It's not. It was not a very good spot because of swamps and malaria and various other problems. So then they moved the settlement further downstream. But Potchefstroom has got this river running through it. Now, the Mooi River is not a big river. It's one of the tributaries of the Vaal. It's not a big river, but it's a constant river. It runs all the time. So there's always water there. And as a result, the Mooi River Valley, which is not a valley in the sense of steep hills, because it's a very flat area, but it's a slight indent, and the floodplain of the Mooi River is a wonderfully fertile area. So that's one of the reasons why the Boere chose this, because it was a great place for farming. You had water, you had fertile ground, you had a flat area. It was ideal for farming in many, many ways. And Potchefstroom, the Mooi River has always been the lifeblood of Potchefstroom. It's always been the lifeblood. The town has depended on that. And when the first of the dams was built further up, upstream, they laid canals through the town. And these canals had little tributary canals. And every single block in the town had canals going past it. And there were metal divisions that were put in to stop the flow of water, and then it could be turned into the nearest residence. So every property in Potch had access on certain times to water through these canals. And as a result, Potch had the most incredible gardens and the most beautiful orchards. And you can ask us from the boarding school, because we used to organize highly organized fruit raids on the fruit orchards, and bring back to the hostel, bring back bags full of the most wonderful grapes and peaches and apples and every fruit you could think of would grow in Potch. So the Mooi River was really something wonderful. And in about 1912, the Old Boys Society of Potch Boys High was formed. And those old boys decided, for whatever reason, they decided that an old boy from Potch Boys High should be known as an old Mooi. And I think this is partly due to the fact that the school's magazine, which was already in existence at that stage, was known as the Mooi. So every year the school magazine came out and it was called the Mooi. And of course, those of us who know Afrikaans know that mooi means pretty or beautiful. So this magazine was the pretty magazine, die Mooi. And the Mooi gave its name to the old boys of Potch Boys High, and they became known as Old Moys. And it became acceptable to place, usually in brackets after your name, the words, the letters OM. And most people have no idea what it means. Some people think that it's the British abbreviation for the Order of Merit. It is, but it's not what it is with us. OM stands for Old Moy. And any old boy of Potch Boys High will know if he sees the letters OM behind somebody's name, he knows that's an old boy. That's an old boy of my school. He's an Old Moy. So they're not called old collegians. They're not called old boys highs. They're called Old Moys. And that's what an Old Moy is. So I have a number of other post-nominal letters that I can write behind my name, but the last one is always OM, because that's a very important one to me.
That's fascinating, sir, because there's something to say about tradition. And I think in your life, we've absolutely seen how a good school, good teachers, caring teachers can turn a life around. And from there on, that boy becomes a man and he just goes up in life. He just succeeds. It's fantastic. But now I have a last question for you. So I ask every paratrooper this. I kind of know what your answer is going to be, but let's hear. I am told, sir, that females look at the paratrooper beret and the man wearing it very kindly. More kindly so than what she would look at like at the infantry or the monsters, you know, they stink of diesel oil anyway, and so forth. Would that be true, sir? Would that maroon beret help you on the female front?
Of course, you're making a fundamental error here. The person to ask that is not a paratrooper. The person to ask that is a lady, a pretty lady. What I can say is that I knew very few paratroopers who did not have a girl who loved them very much. I also know that my wife has a high regard for paratroopers. And I also know that sometimes the gate guards at one paraben used to have quite a job keeping some of the ladies of the night from Bloemfontein away from the gate. I don't know whether they tried that hard, but they did have that problem. And there is another aspect, and that is that there used to be an institution where the current School of Armour is in Bloemfontein, which is on the hill just behind one paraben. And it was a girls' reformatory. And the ladies who were incarcerated in that institution were known as the Tempe Tigers. And most paratroopers will tell you that a man passing by the Tempe Tigers wearing a black beret or a green beret or a blue beret was reasonably safe. But any man wearing a maroon beret, a burgundy beret, who came too close to the fence was putting his life in danger. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Absolutely, sir. Because I must confess, I was at Koffsies at the university for 5 years, and that's my articles there as an attorney. Then we've seen these paratroopers. In later years, we've seen them as well. And you know, sir, they do look like soldiers. They lean, they fit, their beret is at the perfect angle. There's an aura. I don't care who says what. And I do know at the university, girls, they were women, of course, by that time, Oh yeah, they did look very fondly to the paratroopers. There's no doubt about it. I can testify.
Well, the paratroopers all like to think that.
I have to ask you a genuine last question, sir. You know, all the paratroopers were, of course, in a later era than you, which I spoke to, and they all talk about this running battle between armor and the paratroopers. And I've seen it myself, you know, these people would hunt each other down just for fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. Esprit de corps is a very good thing. I know you commanded the unit at a much later stage, and we'll get to that. And I feel sorry for everybody who now has to wait a week before we can continue with your story, because I really would like to know myself. Did you have any such kind of problems in the beginning years, or the other units trying a bit of a fist fight now and then?
Yeah, there's a long history to that, Koos, and it's an interesting history. You know, and one of the ironies of it is that a significant number of the very first paratroopers to be trained to establish the Parachute Battalion in South Africa in 1960, those who went over to the UK and were trained there, and even quite a number of those who subsequently joined the unit were from the South African Armored Corps. Willem Lowe, the founder and first commander of 1 Parachute Battalion, served in 1 SSB as a tank commander during the Italian campaign in the Second World War. Johnny Kisser, who is a legend, or was, he's dead now, amongst the paratroopers, and was probably the most experienced parachutist in the South African military. Certainly one of the most highly qualified, both in the civilian field and in the military field. Johnny Kisser was a corporal in the South African Armored Corps when he went over to be trained as a paratrooper. Eysterman van Niekerk, who later went to the Marines and commanded the Marine Training School in the South African Navy, he started off in the South African Armored Corps. So there's a long history of association with the armor when it comes to the paratroops. However, what few people realize is that when it was decided that that 1 Parachute Battalion should be established in Bloemfontein, and that, by the way, was a political decision. It was in the constituency of the Minister of Defense, and that's where he wanted it. The board that made recommendations initially recommended that the Parachute Battalion should be established where the Air Force Gymnasium is today, right next to Swartkop Air Force Base, because one of the primary requirements was that the Parachute Battalion must be next to a military airfield. So that was the first choice, and the second choice was Potchefstroom, right next to the military airfield in the military base at Potchefstroom. And Bloemfontein was the third choice, and the problems with Bloemfontein were that the airfield was not a military airfield. The Tempe airfield was a civilian airfield, and it was not right next to the base. It was more than a kilometer away. And the nearest Air Force base was right on the other side of Bloemfontein, at Air Force Base Bloemspruit, which was then still an Air Force station. But anyway, it was a political decision, and the decision was it must be in Bloemfontein. So now they have to find a suitable base for the Parachute Battalion in Bloemfontein. And the base which was available is the base that is currently used by 1SSB, and it was found to be unsuitable because the 1SSB base had been an Air Force radio school during the Second World War. And the Air Force had built a big hangar inside that base. And that was in that hangar that the radio training was done. And of course, when after the war, when the Air Force station or the Air Force base closed down, the base was taken over by the Army, and it was decided to place, when 1SSB moved from Pretoria to Bloemfontein, 1SSB was placed in that base. But now it was decided that that hangar is actually what is needed for the parachute training apparatus to be constructed in. And next to the hangar, there's a place where they can put up the ARPCOS, the outdoor exit trainer, and build the outdoor swings and the aircraft mock-ups. So we need to take this base and give it to the paratroops. And we need to eject 1SSB, and they must go into the base next door, which was a smaller base and didn't have such good facilities. So this took place. Again, it was a political decision, not a military decision. But the armor were obviously more than a little cheesed off with this. So they were not exactly well disposed towards the 1 Parachute Battalion when this happened. What the situation was that there was a fence, just a fence, between 1SSB and 1 Parachute Battalion. And the Permanent Force NCOs were actually the ones who instigated the rivalry. I think there was a fair amount of rivalry between the NCOs of the various units. It was the normal friendly rivalry that you would have between units stationed in the same area. But when it came to the paratroopers, there was another issue that began to raise its head. Paratroopers were all selected. The armor guys at 1SSB were not. They were balloted, and later they were conscripted and just placed there. And they weren't placed there because of any exceptional capabilities. What you found the paratroopers starting to do, and it was not something that I used to do, and it was something that I decried and was very much against, but it was very, very popular amongst a large section of the paratroopers. When the selection teams went out to select potential paratroopers, they made a point of selecting all the best sportsmen they could find. Whether it was at 5-Psi, at 6-Psi, at 1-Psi, at the School of Anti-Aircraft, at the School of Armor, at wherever they were entitled to select the best troops to become paratroopers. And they selected the sportsmen. They questioned the guys, found out what their sporting achievements were, and they selected them on that basis. And I objected to this very strongly because when I was a company commander at 1 Parachute Battalion, we were constantly, our training was constantly disrupted because of sportsmen having to go in for sports training and for competitions and for matches and for various other things. And often your sportsmen were very good soldiers because they were good sportsmen, they were fit people, they were very, and they were often corporals. So you'd be practicing to do a night attack, and all of a sudden you get a message saying all the rugby players have got to go in. And half your section leaders are gone. And by the time you have to do your attack tonight, they're not back yet. So you've got to do your attack without your section leaders. So as a company commander, I objected very strongly. Of course, I wasn't a great sportsman. So sport was never a big issue to me. But those people who were keen sportsmen, in the Parachute Battalion, they were adamant that sport that's a priority. So when the inter-unit sport took place, invariably the paratroopers would win because they had all the best sportsmen, which was actually downright unfair. But I mean, these guys were given the option, and they were told, "Look, you come to us. We'll promote your sport. You'll be given every opportunity. You'll be able to play provincial. You'll be able to do." So the guys would come, and at one stage it got so bad that there were some of the commanders at one parachute battalion who wouldn't even allow the best sportsmen to do the parachute course in case they got injured. So they stayed at the unit, but they never qualified as paratroopers. So you had all sorts of unacceptable practices that did take place that were to the detriment of the unit ultimately. Of course, they were not to the detriment of the unit in the eyes of the sports people, because they were the guys who won the sports trophies. They were the guys who won the athletics. They were the guys who won the rugby. They were the guys who won the cricket. They were the guys who won the hockey. They were the guys who won the boxing. Boxing was a big thing. And we had quite a few boxers, but we had guys who were not boxers at all. They were just extremely aggressive. So they managed in the boxing ring. So this did contribute to that as well. So there was a strong sense of rivalry within the units in Tempe, and it became so that for the units, and particularly when one side was transferred from Oudtshoorn to Tempe, and now suddenly you had a huge big infantry unit in Tempe, and now they became, the armor were relatively small corps, but now you had this massive big infantry battalion, and then they later started doing the training of the mechanized leaders and so on, and they had the mech leader wing and so they had a huge unit, and they became a very real threat to the paratroopers. So the rivalry and the competition got sometimes it would get out of hand, and the NCOs at one parabon used to actually they used to goad the troopers into getting into fights with the armor. One of the aspects that was very, very common in my time there was no TV in those days. And you had a cinema just outside the gate in Tempe called the Rendezvous. The abbreviation was Rondies. Now, if you did well enough in your inspection, and if you satisfied the BOS, the battalion orderly sergeant, on the way out, that you passed his inspection, then you could go and watch a movie on an evening at the Rondies. But in the Rondies, where these tiered seats led down to the screen, there was a section at the back which the paratroopers reserved for the paratroopers. And woe betide anybody from any other unit who dares sit in any of those seats. Even if there are only 3 paratroopers there tonight, they sit in that block and nobody else sits there. And this led to some altercation on occasion. And you would sometimes have guys from one of the other units who would go and plonk themselves down there and say, "I'm sitting here." And then it would result in a brawl. And they'd tear off the Rondies apart. And there were frequent appointments to go out round to the back of the Rondies and have a regular duel there between 2 guys who got on one another's nerves. So we had the situation that we used to wear what was called battle dress. It was a sort of a Second World War style bloused top with your collar and tie, and these bloused trousers with your boots on. And then you wore around your waist, you wore your web belt. But the paratroopers would use their battle dress to their advantage, because they'd be wearing these awfully big and heavy jumping boots, and they'd use those to kick the armor guys, and they'd take their web belt off and they'd beat the armor guys with the web belt. So eventually they stopped us wearing battle dress to the Rondies. We had to wear what was called step outs. You still wore the battle dress top, but you wore your tunic trousers with shoes and no wear belt, which was, we regarded it as a bit of it wasn't really a soldier's dress that we wanted to wear battle dress. But anyway, we were now not allowed to wear that. So what then happened is you'd go down to the BOS where the battalion orderly sergeant would inspect you. And then you can halt in front of the mirror, check yourself, make sure you're right, and then go into the BOS's office, and then he would do a check of you. And then he would check all the shiny badges and the position of everything and whether everything is ironed and so on. And when he's checked everything, then he'll put his hands around your waist. And he'll say, to feel what's under your bunny jacket, your battle dress jacket. And he'd say, "Waar's your wear belt?" And then you'd say, "Aan die bungalow, corporal." And he'd say, "Gaan haal your wear belt." And then you put your wear belt on underneath, so that if there's a fight there, you can take out that wear belt, wrap it around your wrist, and climb into the other guys. So it got quite nasty, and there were quite often occasions when people were hospitalized. And what the permanent force guys used to do is they would egg us on. They'd say, "You know what the bomber guys were saying about you guys?" And then they'd make up some sort of nonsense story. And they'd say, "Why don't you guys climb over the fence and go and show them who's boss?" And the guys would climb over the fence and they'd take a balsak, a kit bag, and put an iron in it, a strijkijster. And then wade into a bungalow, swinging this thing around and smacking the guys on the head with that sort of thing. And guys ended up in hospital. I mean, it was atrocious. So there were some nasty things that took place as a result of the rivalry, but generally it was just poking fun at one another and passing comments through the fence and little things like that. And then, of course, at the sports stadium, there's the singing, to try and sing louder than the other guys and to try and decry them and make up songs that put them in a bad light and so on. But what I will say is this, and I think that's very important to say. In 1975, when Operation Savannah took place, the paratroopers and the guys from 1 SSB, for the first time, found themselves going into action together. And that happened at a couple of skirmishes on the border, and then later with some of the fighting that took place further into Angola. And that had a profound effect, because suddenly the guys realized, these guys are not the enemy. These guys are my friends. These guys are looking after me. Those guys are the enemy. And suddenly the aggression and the animosity was channeled in a different direction. And the guys began to work together. And I personally experienced occasions when the guys in the Noddy cars, the armored cars, the Eland, they worked so well with the paratroopers on operations and so closely. The cooperation was phenomenal because the situation had now changed. One must remember, in the 60s, there wasn't a war yet. And here you are training guys, paratroopers, you're selecting them for their aggression and you're training them to hone their aggression and make them more aggressive. But there's nobody to fight. So what are they going to do? They're going to find somebody to fight. So if they weren't beating up civvies at one of the nightclubs in Bloemfontein, they were trying to beat up the armor in the camp next door. So that's how a lot of it happened. But as I say, as the war progressed and as the guys began to realize we're in this together and the enemy's over there, not here, not the guy next to you. The guy next to you, I depend on him. He's got to help me. I can remember one of the most glorious things I'd ever seen in my life was when we were in the bush during an operation and the Air Force notified us that there were tanks on the way. And all we had were a couple of 89mm rocket launchers. Now, if you're very lucky, you might stop a tank with one of those, but you'd have to be very close and very lucky. So paratroopers and tanks don't go down well together. There's a problem there. And we were told there's somebody coming from the other side. And we thought it was tanks. And we were preparing to ward off these tanks. And we heard this crashing through the bush. And suddenly a vehicle lurched through the bush and a long barrel, a gun barrel, stuck out forward through the bush. And I looked at that barrel, and it was a 90mm barrel. And I knew, this is our guys, this is the armor. And I yelled at the guys, hold fire, hold fire. I was never so pleased to see the armor as I was on that day. So things changed, and our enemies became our friends.
That's fascinating, sir. I have a lot more questions, but I think it will have to wait for the next one.
Yes, sure.
But please remind me to ask you, sir, unless you can answer us quickly, why were the paratroopers wearing their parachute wings on their shoulders like the British Army and then changed over to the on front of the chest? Is there any story behind that? I know the British Army had something to do with the RAF pilots, if I'm right, where they complained that it might reduce their status as air crew.
The British always wore the parachute wing on the right shoulder, the upper arm, in fact. They always wore it there from the Second World War when they first introduced it. They were one of the few countries that did. Other Commonwealth countries also adopted the practice. And when our guys went over there and they were awarded their wings, and they did the course in 1960, they did the course with the RAF. The RAF awarded them their wings. They just automatically sewed their wings onto the arm, the upper arm. But what the practice that the British had, and which was also valid in the South African Air Force, but which the RAF had, the RAF would only allow air crew to wear wings on the left chest above the medals. Only air crew were permitted to do that. So a pilot could wear his wings, a navigator could wear his wings, a radio operator could wear his wings, an air gunner could wear his wings, because they're all air crew. They're part of the air crew, and that was a special privilege that was given to air crew to wear them on the left side above the medals. Parachute instructors were regarded as air crew because they were also dispatchers, and a dispatcher is part of the crew of the aircraft. He dispatches the guys who are jumping. So all parachute instructors qualified as dispatchers, and they wore a half wing on the left side as a air crew. So when Willem Lowe and his 14 merry men qualified as paratroopers, they all sewed the British parachute wing onto their arm. The Army one on the Army guys and the RAF one on the SAF guys. They all sewed it onto their tunic, and that's where they wore it. They then went, the Army guys then did a parachute instructors course, which included dispatching. And that parachute instructors course, I forget how long it was. I think it was about six or 8 weeks that they did this course. We have it as separate courses, dispatchers and instructors and so on, DZ safety officers, but that it was all combined into one course. And at the end of that course, they all qualified for the RAF half wing, which they then all sewed onto their left chest above the medal ribbons. That was acceptable. And when they came back to South Africa, they had those badges on. They wore them for a while. But at that stage, the new, in fact, the chief of the defense force at that stage, the Commandant General, was Grobelaar, who was a Second World War veteran. He didn't have an issue about it, but he had a deputy who later became Commandant General. And that deputy was an Air Force man who had not only refused to take the Red Oath during the Second World War, he'd actually taken a transfer away from the Defence Force to the Department of Transport, so that he would not have to serve in uniform throughout the war. And that man his name was Rudolf Hiemstra. And Hiemstra objected strongly to these guys wearing a British parachute wing and a British instructor's wing. He said they must take it off. So they were forced to take it off. They then designed their own South African wing and a cloth wing and a South African instructor's wing. Initially a half wing, cloth half wing. They looked very similar to the British one, just you could see it was different. And that's what they wore. And the first instructors wore that, and the first South African paratroopers wore that on there. A different wing from the Brits, but the same practice was still maintained. And the SAF also had this practice that only air crew may wear an insignia above the ribbons. That happened, that continued for a while, about 2 years, I think. And then the South African Army paratroopers decided they wanted a different instructor's wing, not a half wing. They wanted a full wing. And it's not an Air Force badge, it's an Army badge. So the Air Force have got no say in it. They want a full wing, and they will continue to wear it above the medal ribbons, which they did. Very few people had medal ribbons in those days unless they were World War II veterans. But Willem Lowe certainly did, and they got the metal instructor's wing, which is still worn today, and they wore that. The cloth wing was continued to be worn on the arm. What they decided to do was, if you had done more than 50 jumps, you would be allowed to move this wing from your right arm to your right chest, above your pocket, not the left chest, not where the medal ribbons are, but you could wear it over here. And that's what they did. So 50 jumps or more, you could transfer your wings to here. So the older, more senior guys, you can see they wore their wing over here. If you did the dispatcher's course, then you could move that wing, the small wing that you wore over here, it had been moved here. You could now move it from here to this side, because now you're aircrew. So the small wing plus the instructor's wing could both be worn above the medal ribbons only if you were aircrew. In other words, a dispatcher qualified. And that continued until about 1968. 68. In 1968, it was decided we need to go the American way and not have a cloth wing at all. We must have a metal wing, and we must wear it on the chest. So they designed a very attractive metal wing, the one that's still worn today. And that wing, a bronze one, if you qualified. If you had 50 jumps or more, you could wear a silver one. And later, if you were free-fall qualified, the blue background between the rigging lines could be replaced by a red background. But if you were not a dispatcher, you could only wear that wing on the right. If you were a dispatcher, you could wear it on the left. And if you're an instructor, you could wear it on the left. And that continued for until about 1976. So about 9 years. Then Constant Viljoen had qualified as a paratrooper, but just a paratrooper. So he wore his wing on the right side, as did all paratroopers at that side. Right up until 1976, everybody, when you qualified, you wore your wings on the right side, a metal wing. But then the army said, but this is, Constant Viljoen actually said, but why do we wear our wings? Why can't we wear them on the same side as all other wings? The Air Force wear all their wings on the left side. Why can't we wear our wings on the left? No, it's an Air Force regulation. So he said, I'm chief of the army. Army regulation. We wear them on the left. So everybody transferred their wings to the left. And that's where they all wear them today, above the medal ribbons, on the left, whether you're basic qualified, free-fall qualified, dispatcher qualified, instructor qualified, you wear them over here. The wings differ a little bit, depending on your qualification, colors and size and so on. but you all wear your paratrooper wing on the side. And the Air Force later, after 94, they introduced a metal wing as well, because they'd always worn the cloth wing, but then they introduced a metal wing as well. So now we've just gone a South African way. It's a different way, that's all. But you'll find that the Australians still wear their wing over here. The New Zealanders wear their wing over here. The Brits, of course, all do. In many other countries, Commonwealth countries, like Ghana and places like that, they still wear their wing over here. But some of them have also changed. The Indians wear theirs on this side. I think the Pakistanis wear theirs over here. So it's changed. You know, every country makes their own regulations, and I think it looks better on the left, above the medal ribbons. Of course, now you have the issue. The Special Forces guys say, why can you wear parachute wings, which is a lesser qualification, and operator's wing, operator's badge you've got to wear on the right side? Why can't you wear that on the left side? Well, the tradition is wings on this side. But of course, the Navy changed that too, because they wear their what do they call that badge? The bridge watchkeeping, the watchkeeping badge for navigation. They wear that above their medal ribbons as well. So now all three, Army, Air Force, and Navy, have got something to wear above their medal ribbons. That's fine.
Well, Internet, we've come to the end of this episode. There are quite a few more. General, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for telling us the history, the story. I think your dad and your granddad would be very proud of you today. I think what you've achieved, despite the hardships, so we bow in admiration towards you. It's fantastic. Thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And I want to say to everybody else listening here, you were not unimportant. Everybody played a role. Come and tell me your story. If you feel you have a story you want to share with us before the, therefore something arrives, please come and talk to us. Let these stories not die with you. Until we meet again, God bless.